So are you all okay with that? So let me start again. I was just thanking Adam for taking time out on a bank holiday to come and share his role here in the BRIM project. And I'm grateful for everyone here coming and giving up of their time here on this bank holiday. Let's start with introduction. Let's go with Lauren first, if that's okay, and then we'll move on to you, David. Adam's just covered his role, his journey as being somebody that was made use of the services of Recovery Connections. He then went back into the workplace. That didn't work for him really, and now he's come back here and is involved in various projects. And he's a BRIM project lead. Have I got that right, Adam?
That's correct, David.
Great, cool. So that's a perfect example with someone that's got lived experience and has integrated into the outside world and realized he'd much rather do a lot more in kind of creating recovery capital for those for those other people out there. Great. And if you could give us your titles as well. Oh, wonderful, clever people. Lauren, you go first, love.
Hi, so I'm Dr. Lauren Hall, and I'm a lecturer in criminology at the University of Lincoln. And lots of my research looks at how we help people recover and move away from offending behaviours. So thinking about the social processes within that more broadly.
Okay, and could you just expand a bit more on what criminology is and?
Yeah, of course. So criminology broadly engages with thinking about why people offend, what crime is, how we stop offending, and that's a very broad umbrella. Lots of people think about lots of different things under the umbrella of criminology. I have a colleague, for example, who studies green criminology and thinks about the impact on the environment of sort of harmful processes. So lots can sit under that, but I look specifically at recovery from addiction and desistance from crime, which is sort of a recovery equivalent of for offending, I suppose. So thinking about how people move away from offending and live happy lives. So yeah, they're my focuses. I think I've chosen to focus in on those because they're the most hopeful. Within criminology, there's a lot of doom and gloom. There's a lot of focus on the negatives, what goes wrong. But desistance and recovery are, hopeful processes where people can live better lives. So that was important to me.
Great stuff. So I just want to build on that quickly for the context of people watching. And particularly in the South African context, somebody might get a criminal record for using substances, illicit substances. They get that record, and then they're unable to go into the workplace and integrate back into society because they've got this record, so they can't go and get a job, and then they re-offend and go back to crime to support their family, and it becomes a real systemic challenge, which isn't unique to South Africa. The difference in the South African context being a third world environment to the first world UK environment, there's a lot more social support within the UK. It might not feel like it for ex-offenders in the UK, but from my lens, there really is. And then if we look at the States, that's a whole other that's a whole other can of worms. So thank you so much.
That's okay.
David?
Yeah, I'm afraid I've got a lot of jobs and titles, but it's really just a consequence of being old. So my name is Professor David Best. I am the Director for the Centre of Addiction Recovery Research at Leeds Trinity University. I'm the President of the Recovery Outcomes Institute, which is based in Florida in America. I am the Chair of the British Criminological Society Prison Research Network. I'm an honorary professor in the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University in Canberra. I'm an associate professor at Eastern Health Clinical School at Monash University in Melbourne in Australia. And I basically am a researcher around, most importantly, a research recovery. And over the course of the last 15 years or so, more important than any of those kind of paper things, I've probably collected about 3,000 recovery stories in Scotland, England, Wales, New Zealand, Australia, America, and Canada.
So what drives your passion, David? Can I call you David, or do I have to say Professor?
Oh, no. David is fine, and yeah, and let's stick no titles. So well, I don't know. I mean, I guess if I have my own lived experience as a family member. So I was brought up in an alcoholic household, and very sadly, my dad never found recovery. So that was pretty much it. He had various half-hearted, unsuccessful attempts, and I suppose to some extent it comes from that. I trained as a psychologist years and years ago, and it always struck me how poor specialist addiction treatment services were, how transactional and limited they were. And I worked for years at probably what was regarded as a centre of excellence, the National Addiction Centre, which is based at the Maudsley Hospital in South London. And the treatment people got was just dreadful. And we as professionals genuinely believed that we kind of sprinkled magic dust on people, and we'd no interest in what happened to them when they weren't in the clinic receiving whatever kind of talking therapy or pharmacotherapy they were to get. And, you know, we came up with all these bizarre crackpot models and interventions and treatments. And that continues to today. I was amused to see that at the Royal College of Psychiatrists, there was a whole section on various brain-based interventions, and the search for magic bullets continues. And I still think of addiction primarily as a kind of referring to the industry of people whose mortgages get paid from it. And the recovery world just strikes me as something far more optimistic and upbeat and exciting to be involved in. I know it's not one or the other for a lot of people, but for me, recovery is really just the passion and the drive for me now is really about that kind of hope, that sense of connection and hope that's so inspiring.
Okay. And Lauren, if I could ask you the same question.
Yeah, in terms of what brought me to the field.
Yeah, to be here on a public holiday, you've got to be passionate about this for some reason.
Yeah, so very similar to David in terms of familial impact. I've not experienced these processes myself, but I do have family members who still struggle with drinking particularly. And like David, they've attempted, I think the longest was 1.5 years without substances, before just sort of regressing back into the same patterns. But I hadn't really got any sort of knowledge or awareness of desistance and recovery prior to my degree. And it's something that I didn't do particularly well at school. I ended up in clearing for university, which compared to all my peers was not good. And I hadn't really thought about studying criminology much before I just sort of launched myself into it. So it wasn't something I'd sort of put much thought to until I engaged in the programme. And it was there that I started learning particularly about desistance, and that really resonated with me in that context of the sort of negatives, thinking about why the criminal justice system doesn't work and how it harms people. I saw desistance as this opportunity to think about how we can change that. And I suppose once I then began my PhD with David supervising and brought recovery into that, it really just made sense to me to bring those concepts and ideas together, because separating them out when so many people experience sort of a crossover between addiction and contact with the criminal justice system in some way. Not everybody, but there is a lot of crossover. And I think those people are particularly disadvantaged. So to be able to sort of help and see people recover, I think is really helpful for me.
Okay.
Personally.
Sorry, can you just explain to me, you said at university you're in clearing. What does that mean?
Yeah. So it means that the universities you applied for basically said you can't come because you haven't got the right grades. So it means
I know that movie.
So you're putting to a sort of, there's a day when you can sort of contact other universities who open up their phone lines and you can sort of try and negotiate a place with them. But it's not what you originally planned for because the grades weren't where they expected them to be.
Okay, great. So if I can just build on that quickly and just go to Adam, is the one of the challenges with a lot of people with lived experience and my own personal experience, I performed very badly at school. Yeah. And then I got let into university based on life experience in my late 40s, mid 40s. Yeah, and I started to see how the whole academic world was structured, and thought that, and I say this with humility, but that we could do better. So I saw the benefits of it, yeah, and the liabilities of not being able to get people educated to show up in a professional way. So we've really tried to take people's traumatic past, lived experience, and turn that into an asset. And with Adam being coming along and doing our systemic wellness practitioners training, he needs to provide a body of evidence that he's done some work to evidence how he's integrated the learnings into something practical. So this here will be part of that. So Adam, if you could just touch on your role and what you've created, so we can tick that box and tell the people that yes, this is what we've done. We're good, honest people.
Yeah. So the kind of my way of thinking kind of ties in with what everyone else has said so far. Different experience, of course, but I actually did quite well at school until the halfway point, to which then I started to get into. I wouldn't say I mixed with the wrong people. I think I changed as a person depending on what was happening in my world at that time. And then I was actually expelled from school without any grades whatsoever. But managed, I suppose, because I had the capacity and capability to be able to mix and talk with people, and I suppose sell myself, if you like. I was able to kind of bimble through life, you know, blagging my way through. And I had I had some really good jobs. You know, it's funny, on paper, my CV looked fantastic, but the truth behind it was a lot different to what was on there. But you know, I never went into education again until I'd been through rehab. I don't know whether my experience necessarily helped me get into university, because I still had to do my access to higher education course. But when I did my psychology undergrad, I suppose, having been through the process of recovery, but also having been through the process of trying and failing so many times, once I got into recovery, I was able to see why it hadn't worked when I tried before and why it was working now. And I believe, you know, a lot of those social factors played a really big part in my recovery. And I think understanding myself, understanding how I thought, being able to regulate myself, but also being able to create all of these elements of recovery capital, which add to the overall safety net, if you like. And then when I was at university, so I did psychology with counselling skills. And I suppose similar to David, when I was talking to a lot of the people there, you know, they were talking about this kind of magic bullet, and we were looking at various different, I suppose, mental illnesses and, you know, what was causing that. And I often questioned, you know, is it not just because of the way that we live? Is it not just because of the stresses that we face in this society that we've created? Is that not what is causing a lot of the problems? And a lot of the academics I was speaking to wouldn't have it. They believed that there was lots of different scientific reasons as to why. And I believe there is, you know, there's evidence to suggest that. But I think it can be a lot simpler than that. And I personally had proven that it wasn't you know, any great big scientific model that got me well. It was just changing the way that I thought. and thinking myself, well, really being able to look at my experiences, the shame, the guilt, and letting that stuff go, and being and having hope, like David said, knowing that I can get well based on the people that I was working with, and which is why I chose trauma-informed practice as my master's subject, because I really didn't want to go down the psychology route anymore. I was much more interested in how people's life events shape them throughout their life, and for many people can end up going down that road of addiction, because that's exactly how it worked for me. There was no one significant thing or one big event which caused me to go down the route I did. And I had I suppose I had a relatively happy childhood, really. It was just all these little traumatic events which shaped and built me as a person, and that created these barriers within me, which led me to go down that route. So I was more interested in how trauma affects people, which is why I chose that particular subject for my master's. And that's the kind of stuff that I'm implementing within my role now. It's not some great big scientific, like David said, silver bullet approach. It's literally looking at what's going on with people, what resources do they have around them, what are they thinking, why do they think that way, and how can they change their perception of themselves and their environment.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we've created a container here. We've got an adult learning environment. How would the three of you like to deliver this? We've got about an hour and 10 minutes, I hope. David sent me a presentation, which is all hooked up and ready to go. How would the three of you like to go through this?
Well, I think if David's happy to go through that presentation, I'm sure that will raise very many points for us to talk about.
I've also got some slides as well, if I could send them over to you, David, if you'd like them to fit in or not, however.
Sure, yeah. You can send them to me, or I can let you share this the screen, and you can go through them. If you want me to do the tech, I'm fine with that.
As we've probably already found out, I'm terrible with tech, so if I could send them.
Okay, so email me the slides. And then, just in the interest of time, why don't we go with you, David, first?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, okay.
Do you want to do the slides? Because otherwise, the hardest part of this for me will be, can I get this share screen business working?
Okay, cool. So I've shared your screen. So I mean, I've given you the option to share your screen. There you Perfect. Go.
Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Let me see if I can get it on to from beginning.
There we go.
Perfect. Hey, so
and he's away.
Off we go. So I shall just start. I am conscious that I always talk for too long in these things, so I'll try and keep this relatively quick. And I hope this will be of interest. I'm going to do a general overview about recovery. So I'm going to say a little bit about some of the things that I have done recently, and I think it's always important to say it's not my own. This work comes from other people, and I have largely stolen, borrowed, developed on, and built other people's work. I basically have taken some of this stuff forward in little bits, and really what I've done primarily is add in measurement to what some other people are doing. So I'm going to start with what I think is a relatively uncontentious thing. And that's actually something that, following a meeting I had, Adam, that I'm going to start asking people in Middlesbrough. So people get a little bit surprised when you say that the overall rate of recovery is 58%. So according to Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, of all the people who have a lifetime substance use disorder, 58% will eventually achieve stable recovery. And that's quite a lot. And when I did a program in North Wales, I asked people to estimate professionals working in acute frontline treatment services, and the average estimate of frontline treatment workers was 7%. 7. In other words, the people you go to address your addiction problem think you've roughly a 1 in 14 chance of getting better, which is incredibly pessimistic. So when we start doing our social distance work in Middlesbrough, I'm going to ask that question and just see what different groups and populations think the recovery rate is. So it's a lot, but it takes on average about 28 years for people to recover. And
what does that mean, David?
From the time somebody first uses a psychoactive substance to the time of having long-term stable recovery is about 28 years. And typically that breaks down. People start in their early to mid-teens with alcohol, tobacco, and I guess increasingly vapes and loaded vapes now. They all kind of use relatively non-problematically to about 20. 18, 19, 20. But even when people first start to get into trouble, they typically will try and address it themselves. So there'll be typically 5, 6, 7 years of half-hearted self-quitting attempts of the kind that both Lauren and myself discussed for family members earlier. Then eventually, when things get too bad, and getting too bad means a whole variety of things to people, they will seek some kind of specialist help or treatment. Then on average, people will have something like 4 to 5 episodes of care over the course of 8 years, followed by the 5 years of the recovery journey. Now, these are averages. So please don't be saying, but I know somebody whose career lasted much longer than 28 years, or somebody whose addiction career lasted much shorter. The point of an average is it's not meant to tell the story. And sadly, we can't say, you've had your 28 years, stop it now, go and do something better. It doesn't work like that. And obviously, and I'll come back to one of the things that will predict whether that time period is more or less is recovery capital. And part of the reason we have the model of recovery capital is so we can start both mapping and also intervening where people are in that journey. And about 15 years ago, I started doing some research work, and I think this is probably just about my first proper project on recovery. And we asked a lot of people who were attending a conference called UCASAD, which you might well remember, David, was a kind of almost like a trade fair for people in recovery in London every year. And we asked a whole load of them a number of questions about their addiction career. And one of the things that was really clear was, and this is well known, not just from us, but from other bits of literature, why people stop is typically because of two things. One, they're sick of the lifestyle. And secondly, because some trigger event just pushes them over the edge. Partner leaves, arrested, hospitalized, something bad happens. And it may not even to an outsider look like the worst thing that happens, but it's the tipping point. It's the one that makes people say, I've had it. What makes people stay stopped is other people, both moving away from using networks and moving into sober networks. And it's really important that they aren't an either or. And we know from other research that people who try and isolate in recovery don't do well. So people need to have other social supportive networks. So if you like, the left-hand side is kind of almost what we'd call the epidemiology. It's just boring facts about recovery. The right-hand side, in some ways, is the much more exciting dynamic stuff, because this is really like almost, for me, this is the treatment manual for recovery. This is what can other people do to help you recover. And if anyone's opening a recovery service, it's not only at what you should aspire to, but for people like me who evaluate them, it's how you tell whether it works or not. So in essence, I could walk into most and you know, again, as I said, I have been a kind of magpie of what I think are other people's interest in ideas. This comes from a research group at the University of Nottingham, led by a guy called Mike Slade, who's done some phenomenal work about mental health recovery. They came up with this wonderful acronym called CHIME. And CHIME stands for Connectedness, Hope, Identity, Meaning, and Empowerment. As a summary of what they found in a review of almost 400 papers, looking at mental health recovery services. And this is just crucial. And for any of you who attempt to do any interventions, you really work out, do you do those things? And the beauty of the acronym is it's nearly in the right order. It's not quite. Because the two golden threads of people recovering are spending time with other people in recovery and doing stuff, meaningful activities. So the first two, and the reason why there's the metaphor of the car here is the thing that starts the process is human connection. It all starts with that spark of human connection. And generally we think of recovery as a peer-based process, a contagion that goes from one person to the other. So the translation from connect to hope is kind of almost like, if they can do it, I can do it. And if I can copy what they do, I'll be all right. And what's more, it has to be of that kind of, I want what they've got. So, you know, the last person you want as your sponsor or role model is a dry drunk who's living a miserable, horrible life. You know, it has to be somebody where you look at it, and it doesn't matter whether it's a person or a group. It could be a 12-step group. It could be a recovery group. It could be, you know, a therapy group. It doesn't matter. But basically, it has to inspire that belief that they have something I don't have and I want that. And I'll get that by copying what they do and being a part of the group they are. And what that hope then does, it generates what we think of as a virtuous circle of meaningful activities that lead to changes in how people see themselves and their sense of group belonging, that creates a sense of empowerment, that creates that sense of self-esteem and self-efficacy that supports change. And look, you know, I'm going to tell you about some research and things I've done over the years, but they all basically point to the same basic things. Spend time with other people, recover, get off your arse and do things. I've blown the punchline of this study already, which is a bad thing. But basically, we did the Glasgow recovery study and we supplemented it with stuff from Birmingham. What happens? Well, the more time you spend with other people in recovery, the more time you spend on meaningful recovery activities, childcare, community group engagement, volunteering, education, training, employment, the more time you spend on those things, the better you do. And it's not complicated. And we gathered a whole range of measures, and those were the biggest predictors. And then we were criticizing the grounds that, how do you know it's not the other way around? How do you know it's not the case that people who already have better well-being then engage in more meaningful activities? So we tested that in 3 English drug action team areas. And we used standard data for physical well-being, psychological well-being, and quality of life. And what we found was that when people start meaningful activities, those things go up. When they stop meaningful activities, those things go down. When there are no meaningful activities at any point in the study window, their scores on all our 3 indices were lower than people who had meaningful activities at the start and at the end. We can't claim causality. We're not far away from saying, look, if you start meaningful activities, your well-being will improve. If you stop, it will get worse. So get off your arse and do things. And incidentally, as a little rider or corollary to that, it's also important to say that for me, that implies to workers as well as clients. You know, that workers who sit on their backsides dispensing wisdom, talking and therapizing people do much, much worse than people who actually get out there and walk alongside their clients and get involved in supporting their activities and their models and beliefs. So
let me just jump in there 1 second. I just want to, just before I miss it. So from a peer recovery specialist or a recovery coach or whatever, they would be the passenger in their client's car. So the client's going, I'm in my car, I'm driving it into recovery, and the coach or peer support mentor or something would be the passenger, whereas in other roles, a psychiatrist or somebody else, they would be driving the car with the patient in it.
Oh, no, I'd go further than that, David. I would switch a car for a tandem and say, look, they should both be pedaling furiously, because there's not one that's getting better while the other's already sitting in a perfect state. They should both be on a journey of growth and well-being, and the whole process should be about them both working to support each other and themselves. You know, because for me, like, one of the fundamental things, I've got all this shit to show, and it doesn't matter whether I show it or not. But the most, like, for me, you know, and the more I think about this, the more important this strikes me. Moving from a treatment model to a recovery model is a fundamental paradigm shift.
Exactly.
It's a fundamental shift in how we do stuff and what we think. So the idea, like, I've already caricatured it, traditional treatment model is you go through all these painful processes of brief assessment and full assessment and dose titration clinics and all that stuff, and then you turn up once a fortnight and you get, you know, you get tested to make sure you haven't been using drugs, and you get a supposedly manualized, accredited therapeutic intervention that will probably be some combination of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and motivational interviewing. You'll get what in Britain is called the Orange Guidelines, books around what you should be prescribed. And you know, you go away and you do what you're told, and you come back 2 weeks later, and if you stick to that process and you do your homework, you'll be better. Well,
how do you feel about that process?
For me, you know, that if you want it and it works for you, fine, but it's not how recovery works, because recovery switches that model from expert patient to partnership. So that's the first thing. And I think there are places and there are personalities in Britain where we're in danger of creating a kind of false recovery expertise. And we need to be cautious about that because it's partnership. The second thing is, it doesn't require a specialist clinic because the vast majority of really important things happen in the community anyway.
Exactly.
The third thing is the assumption of traditional medical models is it's a corporeal process. In other words, both addiction and recovery are things that happen in your body and your head. Whereas for me, recovery especially is something that's interpersonal, not intrapersonal. It happens between people, not inside of people. And and one of the things that makes recovery much more complicated than treatment is if I come up with the most cunning plan ever of how to run a detox service, if I come up with a perfect detox plan, you could then replicate it and run it in Johannesburg, London, Paris, Munich, Abu Dhabi, Melbourne, wherever you like, because it's a technique and a procedure like ingrowing toenails. And if you got it right, you could replicate it. Sadly, recovery doesn't work like that, because recovery is the constant complex interaction between an individual, the social networks they have, the broader cultural contextual environment they live in, right up to and including things like legal frameworks and political and cultural components. So it doesn't work like that. So even if you found the perfect recovery service, let's for the moment say Recovery Connections in Middlesbrough is the optimal paradigmatic recovery service. And you do what people have done before and tried to say, I know, we'll transplant that now and we'll stick that in Cape Town. You'd be very lucky if it worked, because so much of what makes it matter is about what assets you have and what resources you have and where you are and the people and the context and the culture. And so it makes the kind of, from a science point of view, it makes rules much more complex. It makes the process much more difficult to understand because it's not about techniques in the same way. So that's a big diversion, but kind of important to know.
So what is the approach then?
Oh, it's about those fundamental, the CHIME principles, building recovery capital and building on the assets you have and that exist in your community that you can draw on and tap into. And longer term, it's about changing cultures and building greater pathways to connection and opportunity for people while challenging stigma and exclusion. You know,
based on the cultural norms of that particular community.
Of that community and those communities that mesh all around it, you know, and obviously you have to be really cautious. I'm just back from taking my son to London for the weekend for his birthday, and you know, when you walk around London, you immediately become conscious of how glib it is to use the term community, because there are so many complex meanings and definitions of community in a place like that, which is so bubbling and thriving with different groups and communities. So I am really conscious, David, that I don't want to take up this entire session and leave my two co-hosts like 3 minutes each. So I'm just going to go on if that's all right.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's great. But I don't want Adam or Lauren shouting at me at the end of this. So I just quickly want to mention a study that we've just finished, which I'm really proud of, which is the RecPath program, which was about comparing male and female recovery journeys in Belgium, the Netherlands, and the UK. Culturally different places. And we were really lucky because in this study, we studied this in the process prior to COVID. So we literally finished our data collection about 6 months before the first COVID lockdowns. And then the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK gave us some additional money to study the same people in the first year of lockdown. So we got a kind of natural cohort study. And it's just really interesting. So first thing to say, does it matter how long people are in recovery about their riskiness? Yes, it matters hugely. So we found that women were slightly less likely to relapse than men. That's quite interesting. But we recruited roughly equal numbers of people who at the start of the study who were in their first year of recovery, were between 1 and 5 years in recovery, which is called sustained recovery, or more than 5 years, which is called stable recovery. If before the study started, the likelihood of you relapsing in the first year was 1.5%. So about 1 in 66 people relapsed. If at the start of the study you'd between 1 and 5 years in recovery, 17% of you relapsed. So about 1 in 6. For people who at the start of the study were in their first year of recovery, 30% relapsed. Well, there are two crucial messages. I'll deal with the first one. For people whose recovery journeys included peer-based recovery support services, they did better. But the big point about this is, and I'm sure nobody on this call will need to be told this, recovery cannot stop on the last day of detox or the last counselling session. The recovery journey is an ongoing journey of support over potentially many years. Now, one of our other crucial findings, which we kind of imply here, but no, let's state this. People who attended both specialist treatment and mutual aid groups did better than people who attended either or. And so, your earlier comment about treatment, I am not for a minute suggesting there is no place for specialist professional treatment. People who do both do better.
Agreed.
And we shouldn't, without wishing to roll out too many cliches, you do need to be careful about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Treatment will never be enough, or for very few people will treatment be enough. But also, treatment fulfills some very important roles around health and safety and well-being and crisis care management. We also found interestingly and incidentally, we just published this. Thomas Martinelli was a PhD student from the Netherlands who worked in the project. Relapse rates in the year of COVID were actually slightly lower than they were in the year prior to COVID. So among people who were established in the recovery journeys, COVID actually didn't have a particularly significant effect, unlike the general population effects on drinking and drug use or gambling, which we know all escalated during the lockdown window. So that's kind of interesting. Now, in some ways, this is my most important slide. John Braithwaite is my kind of mentor and academic guide, and he's written an astonishingly wonderful book called Macrocriminology and Freedom, which was published last year and is available for nothing on the Australian National University website. And he has argued that social capital, human capital, recovery capital, and restorative capital are unlike financial capital in that they are not depleted through use. When you spend your money from the bank, you deplete your capital. When you trust someone, you do not deplete trust. Trust tends to be reciprocated, and this engenders virtuous circles of trust building. A politics of hope is likewise redemptive as we face adversity. It is infectious. Now, I would not use the word infectious. I would use the word contagious. And the big thing about this, which is so important for the stuff that I was saying earlier, is that, in my opinion, it's really important that we understand and we recognize that we don't think of recovery capital as something that sits inside a person, that it's generative and social, so that, you know, as you recover, David, the community you recover in benefits from that. There's residual bubbling flow of recovery capital outside of you. We have to move away from those kind of medical models of David is now full of recovery capital. We can send him off to somewhere else and then start on the next person. Because there is this complex dynamic where recovery capital happens at social levels. And you'll know from your own social networks that that's true. The breadth and depth of social capital in a network ebbs and flows. The relationships get weaker and stronger. The overall strength of the group diminishes and increases. And it happens at community level. And that is a complex phenomenon that recovery science needs to get its head around. And I've talked about recovery capital, and I always talk about recovery capital. So let's go for some definition. Let's start with the definition. Recovery capital is the breadth and depth of internal and external resources that can be drawn upon to initiate and sustain recovery from alcohol and other drug problems. And incidentally, just so you know, I'm going to stop talking regardless of where I am in my slides at 10:02, just to make sure the others each have kind of 10 or 15, at least 15 minutes each, and a bit of time for questions at the end. So just so Lauren can be prepared, this is your 5-minute warning. But I'm not going to just keep talking. And one of the things that, you know, that I'm not sure they were justified in the claim is that stable recovery is best predicted on the basis of assets, not pathologies. Now, this is from William Cloud, who was one of the original recovery capital authors, and William White, who's like the guru of the recovery field in the United States. I don't think the science necessarily would have justified it in 2008, but I think we're justified in claiming that now. That, in other words, if we want to know what helps people, it's about the strengths they possess, not the barriers they face or the unmet needs they have. And that's a fundamental shift in philosophy of what we do, about how we address recovery, change, and growth. And I'm probably not going to go much further than this. So I was fortunate to work with a researcher from New York called Alexandra Lodi, and we did a bit of work for the Royal Society for the Arts, where we kind of combined our data from her work in New York and my work in Birmingham and Glasgow. And we started to think about, okay, people have been using the term recovery capital for a little while, but nobody had actually gone about operationalizing it. And for me, this was a really important question because it was one of those fabulous terms that people used all the time, like co-production and asset strength-based modeling, but it was all vague and imprecise. And really, I guess for the last 13 years, the majority of my work has been about how do you count this stuff? And what we concluded was that at the end of those 5 years of a recovery journey, there are a group of core internal qualities you want people to have, which we call personal recovery capital. And they include things like self-esteem, self-efficacy, resilience, coping skills, and communication skills. And what it took me a long time to work out was that how you build those things is through the other two slices of the pie. It's through the scaffolding that is afforded by positive social networks and access to community resources. So we originally called this collective recovery capital. Now we refer to it as community recovery capital. But effectively, it's both the strength and positivity, if you like, of the networks you belong to, plus the capacity you have to access the resources you want and need in your community that affords you the opportunity to build those internal strengths that will allow you. So Michael Dennis, a very eminent recovery researcher from Chestnut Health Systems in the United States, has said, what's important about the 5 years of continuous sobriety? Well, what matters about that is recovery is self-sustaining beyond that point. In other words, you don't need the scaffolding. But it seems to me, and again, we're talking averages, it seems to me that we effectively, what the purpose of a recovery capital model is about creating those scaffoldings around people. The support networks, the individual connections, the sense of belonging, but also how do you get people out to do stuff? And I was on a call last week to people in New Zealand who have a wonderful recovery organisation called Speed Freaks in Christchurch. And, you know, what do? Well, they get people out running. It's not a slightly contentious name, I would have thought, but nonetheless, they get people out running. And it was great. Does it matter how well they run? No, not really, because they're in it together and there's this huge sense of collective pride and commitment and challenging stigmatized notions. And they go out wearing Speed Freaks t-shirts and sweatshirts, and they're in the public park on a Saturday and a Sunday morning. And, you know, these things are great. But they do. And the thing that I think I will stop talking about was when we did the second recovery walk in the UK, it was held in Glasgow. And I mean, the first thing for those of a spiritual nature is it was sunny all day and it was Glasgow. So if you don't believe in God, that's more than enough reason to believe in God. Secondly, you know, well, what's the point of having recovery walks? Well, the first thing is it's like a testament, a celebration of people who are doing well in their recovery journey. Fabulous. Secondly, it brings people together. It brings people together to share and enjoy that success and celebration. Thirdly, for people who are not in recovery, it shows it is possible. It is a high-profile, visible event that shows recovery is possible, engaging, attractive, and has positive outcome. Fourthly, it challenges stigma. Because as folks see this, and it was through the streets of Glasgow, and in Glasgow Green, we had the rally at the end. It's a fabulous way of saying, look at these folk having a great day. And look, this is a cheap shot at my home city, but there were several thousand people in Glasgow celebrating. There was no drink, no drugs, and no fighting. Now, that never happens in Glasgow. Fifthly, we managed to get this communities minister, Fergus Ewing, to come along, open the event and talk at the event. So you influence political opinion about recovery, its attractiveness. And sixthly, if there is such a word, you know, there's loads of kids there. So what are you also doing? You're attempting to break the intergenerational transmission of crime, drug use, misery, poverty. You're trying to challenge those things by building collective efficacy and faith. And, you know, there's much more where this came from, but I did promise I would stop. So I will stop, and thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Oh, okay, that was great. Should we just jump straight in for you, Lauren?
Sure, yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Thinking about.
There we go. Does that work for you?
Yeah, I think so. Fabulous. I can see that. So I think David's talk really helps to set the scene for what I'm going to be talking about, actually, particularly in relation to the sort of scaffolding that he was speaking about, because I'm going to be talking about my PhD research today, which I finished in 2019 and have been exploring ever since. But I think anybody who has attempted any sort of research will sort of understand this. I think this work is something I see more clearly, having had some space from it and being able to understand its role and its importance. I think I have a clearer understanding of it now that I've had some time away from it. So what I'm going to do today is I've already told you a bit about who I am, so I won't be talking about that in any real depth. But I wanted to talk about the sort of social factors that I explored during my PhD and which are beneficial to both recovery from addiction and desistance from crime. So I thought it's important to sort of start by defining these ideas insofar as I understood them, because many people define recovery and desistance very differently. There's no one real sort of agreement about what these processes are in the literature, at least. So I thought it was really important to make sure that in the work that I did, it was very much led by the people I spoke to. So they defined recovery themselves. They defined what desistance meant to them. This makes research a little bit harder because we don't have a sort of baseline understanding of what recovery is to be able to compare it across different people. But again, I think that speaks to the subjectivity of these experiences, as we've all sort of acknowledged, and how people go through their journeys differently, and that's okay. So I just wanted to start by sort of caveating that, I suppose. So when I began this work, I was engaging with a few different recovery communities across England, and they sort of helped me gain a better understanding of what recovery and desistance looked like for them, and what recovery support looked like. So whilst I was getting to know these different recovery groups, I was also engaging with the literature on these topics. And what I started to sort of see and to read was that a few social things seemed to be particularly important in helping people move forwards positively, and understanding those seemed to be really important. I suppose I should say, up until much more recently as well, recovery and desistance have been very separated in academia. Recovery research hasn't really enmeshed yet with desistance research. So that was one of my other aims, given that people are so often affected by both, or in spaces where they're experiencing both at the same time. I wanted to understand, how do we bring the research together to help inform practitioners and people experiencing these processes about what it is that helps about these social experiences. And what I started to see was that three things particularly important, and they were relationships, identity, and social capital. So I'll talk a bit more about these. I've got just very simple slides as we move through, but these were the sort of areas that I was looking at particularly. I did this in a really complicated way. I had 4 different types of methods. I spoke to people in interviews. I used a couple of surveys, including the RECCAP, which is the recovery capital measure. And I also did a social identity mapping method as well. And I've got an example of that a little bit later on. So I'll explain a little bit more about that in a couple of slides' time. So what I wanted to do was break the model down and talk about it as, I suppose, sort of knowledge scaffolding to help share what it is I learned about relationships and their importance in desistance and recovery, and why we should have a good understanding of them and think about them in more depth. The desistance field more broadly has engaged a lot with relationships. There's work by Samson Laub, Fergus McNeil, Beth Weaver.
Sorry, Lauren, please just simplify. What does that mean?
So the desistance terminology. Yes. So it's like recovery, but from offending. So desistance is about how people move away from offending as sort of like a lifestyle. It's
like
how
a habitual criminal, a career criminal.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Fantastic. Thank you. Excuse my ignorance around the
No, it's okay.
theory.
And again, like I say, the definitions aren't sort of set in stone, but it's very much like recovery. Desistance is how people start to live sort of well-rounded, happy, fulfilling lives that don't include offending or criminality. However, that might be conceptualized. And again, there's cultural.
Because there is a lot of identity in someone being a gangster or a criminal or something. And now you've become a goody-goody, or you've become a Jesus freak or what, and holding people as their kind of personality. Great. Thank you for letting me understand. Yeah. Keep going. Thank you.
So what I actually found was that people tended to sort of prioritize one of these three things. So I'll come back to that, because the point you just made about having an identity that's really visible or strong, and swapping that for something else was something that definitely came through within the data that I collected. So we know from the desistance literature that relationships have been sort of highlighted as really important. Basically, if people got a job or got married, they were much more likely to stop offending. And there was lots of reasons around that. There's been lots of work since which supports it. And there's surprisingly less in the recovery field on particularly intimate relationships and their role in the recovery process. But but there is plenty on, for example, family relationships, relationships with peers, relationships with staff, and how they can be really important for making sure recovery and desistance either work or, where they need supporting. So I wanted to look at relationships, and I thought I'd speak specifically about one person I spoke to in relation to relationships called Matilda. So that's not her real name. But basically what she spoke about was a journey from being a child right through to sort of early teens as being shaped hugely by various experiences of abuse. And I won't go into detail about what they were, but in the family setting and at school, they were sort of hugely influential experiences for her. So what that meant was that when she left school, she felt isolated. She didn't have close relationships. She didn't have family support. And so she went traveling and connected with a group of people that she later called family. And it was within that context of those relationships that she developed that she ended up using heroin. And that was because she'd created an intimate relationship with one member of that group, but she'd also created lots of really close friendships. So when they began engaging in drug use, it sort of felt natural for her to sort of do the same. And that filled a gap for her. She hadn't had family relationships, and then all of a sudden she had these really close connections with these people that she'd met traveling. From there, obviously, life declined quickly for her. The addiction really took hold. Her partner was not a supportive, positive partner for her. And when she got pregnant, she ended up having to leave him, and she came back to the UK and was still sort of trying to recover. And she did manage to recover and to desist. But to get there, she went through some really dark, difficult times. And she once she had her daughter, that relationship became particularly important to her. And she was sent to prison for a short sentence, and she realized she didn't want to do this anymore. She didn't want to keep disconnecting from this relationship with her daughter. She knew that if she went to prison again, it would be for a much longer time. And that was the moment for her that she wanted things to change. So that relationship became an anchoring point for her to sort of move forwards. And she did really, really well at that. So there was a theme for Matilda of relationships as being sort of negative or lacking throughout her life. But then she entered into recovery and desistance, and they became the most important part of her journey. She became a peer mentor for probation. She developed really close peer relationships. And most importantly to her, her relationship with her daughter improved massively. And this kept her going. So that was
So her identity as someone in recovery that's recovering from heroin, which obviously kind of served a purpose in the beginning. I'm part of a community. I'm part of this, to stay in this community. And because of the laws around it, I have to commit crime. I've left the partner. I want to be a good mother now. I don't want to go to jail anymore. I want to stop this life of crime, and entered into a recovery community and started to build her identity. Fantastic. I'm with you. Good.
And so I hope in that story you can hear the different social factors. So relationships were really important to her. Identity was important because she came from feeling sort of isolated and lost towards being a recovery advocate, supporting other people in recovery and doing that positively and visibly, and also being a mother and being proud to be that mother and to be a good mother to her daughter. She also accessed different social capital at different times. So in this capacity, sometimes social capital wasn't always positive for her. The familial sort of type relationship she developed gave her access to different social resources, but that weren't necessarily recovery and desistance supportive. They were more supportive around the use of heroin, which damaged other aspects. So in relation to identity, I've got another person for whom it was particularly clear this identity journey as being important. So I thought I'd just speak to Mark's journey as well. And as you mentioned at the start, David, about how sometimes people have sort of really strong offending identities, and this sort of needs to change. Mark, who I met in Sheffield, again, that's not his real name, was a really big, well-known drug dealer in that area. For a number of years, he was very well known in that world. He had a number of bars and clubs. He ran security, and he'd really crafted an identity for himself that was very much enmeshed in that world of addiction and offending. When he reached a point where his cocaine addiction had hugely spiraled, he was feeling paranoid, he was losing thousands of pounds each week to this addiction, he reached a point where he decided that he couldn't continue that lifestyle anymore. So what he did was develop a strong recovery identity. And when I spoke to him, the most important thing to him was becoming a visible recovery advocate to show people that if I can do it, anybody else can do it, because I was one of the biggest drug dealers, well renowned in this area, and now I'm one of the biggest recovery advocates. And every day of his week he was attending a different recovery group in a voluntary capacity, speaking, leading meetings, providing support for his local recovery community. So although relationships and social capital were also important, the most important thing to Mark was transitioning that identity to something he could also be proud of, but that was also impactful and visible, because that's what he was used to. That's what he felt confident and comfortable with. And if on the next slide, I've got an example of his map here. So this is a social identity map. This is one of the ways that I aim to sort of understand people's social worlds when it came to recovery and desistance. And Mark here detailed lots of different recovery groups on his map. So just to speak you through it briefly, when we ask people to do a social identity map, they put themselves in the middle, and then they put all of their social groups around the edges. Who are they in contact with? It doesn't matter if it's in a positive or a negative way, just everybody in their social world. You then ask them to use some lines to show how well connected they are to that group. And then you also ask them to show a wiggly line if there's any conflict. So that's the sort of setup of the social map. And we then ask people to sort of use stickers to speak to the identity of that group. So pink with a cross through it means history of offending. Green and blue means in recovery and abstinent. Yellow means casual user drinker, and red means heavy user drinker. So you can see from these stickers that Mark had lots of different people in his social world that were in recovery, some that were still using or drinking, but in the context of a recovery group, because we know people are always going to be at different stages of that journey in the recovery community, and that he was really well connected to some of the recovery groups that he listed. There was some ongoing conflict at that time, but what was interesting about that was when I was speaking to him, when he first went into his recovery, because identity was so important to him, he threw himself into everything. So by the time I spoke to him a second time, this is his second map, he said, actually, I've had to cut some groups out because I was helping too much. Some people were asking for help with their electric, they were struggling for money, and I ended up helping them. And I got so closely connected to this idea of being a recovery advocate that it was starting to actually be detrimental to me. So he cut a couple of groups out.
Kind of codependent, dysfunctional relationship. So I'm really curious about the squiggly line to NA. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so possibly. I think, of course. So what Mark spoke about there was how people within that group specifically had started to utilize the relationship he developed with them in a way that wasn't healthy for him. So for asking for help in a way that sort of crossed boundaries of fair expectation, like asking for money towards electric. He'd feel for people, he would be able to empathize because he'd been in that position, but he realized to keep everybody safe, he needed to start saying no to that. So
sorry, if I can just jump on there from what I found is particularly people with this sort of profile that were kind of big, kind of in the using world. It's such a kind of miracle that they stop using, that they then start spouting advice, which people that they don't have a skill set for. So things that can happen is like, oh, you don't want to be taking those meds because you're using drugs or something, which is really bad advice if those are psychiatric medications. So on the one hand, there's great stuff, and on the other hand, there's some real shadowy stuff that we as a community need to be aware of the limitations. So I love this systemic lens on this. Sorry to jump in there. Carry on.
Yeah, it's helpful. Thank you. Yeah, so I think what was really good about seeing Mark that second time was his understanding that he needed to work some of his boundaries a bit better to help keep his recovery safe and other people's recovery safe. So he acknowledged that to be a good recovery advocate, he was going to have to put some boundaries in around how he worked. And I think that was really positive for his.
And on the time scale, where is Mark at this time? Has he passed the 1 year mark? Is he between 2 and 5 years?
So when I was speaking to him, he was just in, I think, his 11th month, so entering into the first full year. And he's maintained his recovery since. So now obviously we're in 2023 and this work was finalised in 2019. So he's progressed really well, which is fantastic.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sorry. No worries. So the third social factor that I also focused on was social capital. So I think what is easier to see with relationships and identity is how important they are to people. Social capital refers to this idea of social resource that you get from the different people in your life. And it can be very different according to the nature of relationship, to the group, to the person you're connecting with. And so it's not as visible, but it's still really important. And I think a good example for social capital was Lenny. So Lenny was attending another recovery group in Sheffield, and he had had a similar journey to Matilda in lots of ways. He'd had problems in his childhood, nothing too, traumatic, but that he reflected on as being quite important later, with reflection. And what was important to Lenny was this idea of giving back. And so although compared to Mark, his identity wasn't as important. He didn't care about being at the front of the group and leading the group all the time. He cared about making sure that he used his time effectively to help give back to his local community. He'd grown up in this community, he'd offended in this community, he'd damaged familial relationships through his using and offending, and broken down trust. And he felt that for his recovery and desistance to be most successful, he wanted to give back. So again, a lot like Mark, he had lots of different recovery groups that he attended every day of the week. He'd cycle to different groups and just take part and support that group. And he got a lot out of that. And it wasn't that he needed to shout about it. It sort of fulfilled him on a deeper level. So each of these three factors were what I looked at, and they're all really important. To understand each of them, they can all have a pivotal role in the recovery and desistance journeys. And that's important because whilst the research fields are separate, we don't understand how best to sort of support people who are experiencing both at the same time. So these three factors, having an understanding of them and a way of sort of understanding which is most important to people, can help as a starting point, a discussion point to using people's strengths, I suppose, to sort of help increase these areas. So as Matilda's was relationships was the most important thing to her, Mark's was identity, Lenny's was social capital, but each of the three are important overall. And what I also found, David mentioned trust in his talk. Trust was really important in each of the individuals' lives that I spoke to, at an individual level, but also at a group level. And what is important for why we should understand this is because groups have a capacity to support trust beyond the group itself. So we've spoken about recovery walks and recovery visibility. When people had positive relationships, identity, and social capital, they created a level of trust at group level that expanded into the local community. And as an example of this, the Sheffield group told me when I was visiting, and I checked this out afterwards, that knife crime had gone down significantly in their local area since the group had been running. So the ways in which people came together to support one another's recovery and desistance had positive ripple effects on the local community. So when you create trust through positive relationships, healthy identities, and lots of access to social capital, this is beneficial not only for people's recovery and desistance, but also for the locality. It has ripple effects. So I thought that was an important sort of context, and the way that people led as well with particular components was also a way of sort of understanding how we might better help and understand processes of recovery and desistance. So how might any of this be helpful? To summarize, these are the questions that I sort of have reflected on and would encourage people to ask themselves to really understand these different components. So who is important to you and you to them, to really understand your relational aspect in your recovery and desistance journey. How do you see yourself and how do others see you? How important is that? Understanding that could help us to sort of create pathways to recovery and desistance that are meaningful. Some people aren't as bothered about how other people see them. The relationships are more important. So it's about understanding that and then working to enhance those according to what is most important. And then the social capital question. So what do other people bring to you and what do you offer in return? To keep social capital levels sort of topped up, it can't be something that you just take away. You have to be able to give as well. You have to offer time back or advice, knowledge, presence, whatever it is that helps keep that social capital pool topped up. And just as a last thought as well around the trust aspect, and around positive relationships, identity and capital, making sure that groups do not become so bonded that new people can't arrive and take part. So there has to be a sort of fluidity to the group. It has to be open and accessible. So although there needs to be a level of connection, and that's really important, one of the groups that I worked with became so well bonded that new people found it difficult to join and to identify with that group. And that group sadly dissolved later on in the research project. And what that meant was people didn't have those looser connections that helped keep their recovery and desistance going once that group had stopped. So to keep the sort of trust flowing and to keep access to these positive resources, it's important that groups don't become too stagnant and too well bonded. There needs to be a fluidity to it. So these are the things that I sort of looked at and thought about during my PhD. I'm going to stop now, but open, of course, to feedback and questions. Now we're at the end, I suppose, whatever works best.
Fantastic, Lauren. Just one question. What about the family members?
Yeah. In terms of their social components, do you mean, or in terms of their progress?
Well, you gave us 3 examples, which their recovery was different in different areas, yeah? But they would have all come from families that would have been impacted by that one's behavior. The mother that had the heroin addiction, the gangster, and then your third one. They all have family members. What's family members deserve a recovery process themselves.
100%, yeah. So I didn't speak to family members directly, but what I did hear from people was how those family relationships were healed through the process of recovery and desistance. So Lenny, as an example, spoke about how his dad actually found him when he'd overdosed one time, and had to get him to hospital, and it was horrific for both of them. That damaged their trust. He spoke about his dad not trusting him as a result of that, not trusting him when he said, I'm going to recover. It took a long time for his dad to believe that he could do it. And Lenny just kept going. He kept building that relationship. And he said at the end, in his last interview, actually, how much better his relationship with his dad was now, and that he'd grown to trust in his recovery. So it's little things that he suggested that the trust had built, such as he asked his dad to borrow a £5 just to go and get some fish and chips. Once upon a time, his dad wouldn't have lent him the money because he wouldn't have trusted that he was going to use it for the fish and chips. But his dad gave it over straight away and said, yeah, sure, off you go, here you go. And he said that was a moment for him of the relationship having healed in terms of trust.
Because I think what we can do better is start working with family systems while the person is still in a culture of addiction, to assist the family members in changing and working with the stigma and all that. Fantastic. Oh, how's this all going? Do we need a stretch? Do we? Yeah.
No, I think we probably could do.
Oh.
But whilst I think we probably could do, but whilst I mean, actually, I have been when my camera's been going off, I have been jumping up to stretch, because I've had that recovery bike thing of I was out over the weekend, and it, you know,
done.
Well, I might as well tour Starbucks, because it's about as cumbersome. It's just this big lump of metal, and it really hurts my back whenever I take it out. But that's why my camera's been going off. I'm being rude. But that family thing you were talking about there, that's really, really important, and that's an element that we're, you know, really big on incorporating within recovery connections, because this recovery element and the trauma that's experienced by the person who's in addiction is also ripples out to the family, you know, massively. And I remember, I think I was 6 months sober, and my mum still didn't believe that I had capacity to sustain it, and, you know, was quite vocal about that. And I think that's perfectly normal, given 20 years worth of experience of me living the life I was living and letting them down constantly, and all the stuff I was doing, and the threat of me not being alive anymore. So I think to involve the families and educate them and support them, because there's lots of things that are happening for them which we don't take into account sometimes. You know, the families a lot of the time think that it's their fault. They think it's something they've done or something they haven't done. What have we not done to support this person? Why couldn't we get this person well? So there's a whole system there that needs to be supported as well. And I think it's really, really important to get them involved and let them know that there's absolutely nothing that they could have done which would change this outcome. It had to come from the person, you know.
And they get resentful when an outside institution gets them well, and they're kind of sitting there saying, "But we've been saying this for years."
Yeah, but there's an emotional detachment there, which makes it easier to have those conversations. And I think as well, the beauty of lived experience working with someone as opposed to a therapist is a lived experience can call them out on the behaviors sometimes and actually say, no, that's not true. I know, because I've been there and I've felt it and I've done it. Whereas people who haven't lived in that arena, they don't have the experience to, you know, to be able to, for someone to listen to them, you know. It's like, what do you know? You've never been there. And even though it's perfectly great advice and it probably is right, it's just not coming from an influential person. Like David said, that person who they are looking at and say, I want to be you. How do I be you?
Yeah. Look, David, I'm going to have to jump off in about 10 minutes, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. We contracted till past. Where should we go in the last 8 minutes?
Well, I think it'd be useful. Adam, do you want to add anything? Because I kind of feel as if your voice has been pretty quiet. I mean, I think it'd be really useful for Lauren and me. These are supposed to be, I never liked that idea that we're somehow experts. And I think it's always really useful to get the two of you, David and Adam, just to comment on anything we've said that should be learning points for us.
Okay, I'll go. I absolutely love your insight, and I love the academic work that you've been done. And what I really like is the fact that you've approached it from a different angle. You've almost approached it from the angle that someone in recovery would, I suppose, and looking at all those elements. One of the things that it does what you're talking about highlights is what the both of you was what you were saying, David, is that it's such a difficult thing because it changes constantly. You know, this organism, it manifests and it mutilates and then it goes back to its old form and then it changes again. And so it's very, very difficult to measure, and it's very difficult to take a model and implement it and put it somewhere else because of those changing factors.
You know, and
And they,
it's one of the, sorry,
yeah.
Adam, you go.
No, go on.
All I was going to say is it's one of those things that policymakers and funders can be very dismissive for that reason. And I heard someone from the MOJ once refer to this as what they called the starburst effect. And it's a really interesting question about places like Recovery Connections and all the other inspirational places we could name. How much do they rely on one inspirational leader or individual who, if they burn out or leave, that disappears? And for me, you know, one of the genuine challenges is, what does sustainability mean, and is it a good thing? You know, I don't know how Lauren views her role, but I kind of see my role as almost being like the bridge between the recovery community and some of the stuff it does, and the, if you like, the science or the policy communities to couch some of those achievements in language that makes sense academically and politically. Yeah. And that's really two different points. Lauren, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd agree. I thought a lot about what impact I hope to have today, like what I hope to depart, because like you guys are the experts in the lived experience. So what help can I be? And I suppose it's that I've got the ability in a slightly more emotionally detached way, as you said, Adam, as that being important sometimes, being able to share knowledge, to sort of bring things together and provide overviews, because I've got the time to do it from different fields, and to help inform people in practice, commissioners, to hopefully have positive effects, you know, in practice.
It's amazing to look at, and I always come from a point where I'm really open-minded, and I take in all of the information that's given to me, and I think everything that I love everything that you do, because it really does. I can say I know that it links in really, really closely, and it's different, and it's looking at it from an angle where it really is making a difference, and it's identifying the things that will make a difference. You know, it was really interesting there, Lauren, you were saying about the middle guy, Mark, and looking at that mapping of his social network. And you know, it's really good to look at that model, because there was recovery group, and then church and something else. And that just for me highlights, you know, the amount of different coloured dots, you know, flags within those areas, which show that too much of one thing is not right, and there needs to be a balance between all of those.
And you talked about dynamism, Adam, and one of the things that always struck me about that is, you know, in year one, I think it's perfectly reasonable for people to have pretty much all of their network and other people in recovery. But if you're still at that after 5 years, something's gone badly wrong, I think.
Yeah, really, really have to. You know, you have to have that safety net of people who are very, very similar to you within those first couple of years, because, you know, you're still very much in the early stages. You need to hammer home that point of how close you are to that old world still. And you really need that support network around you, you know, which kind of talks about how it was, what it's now, and what you need to do to sustain that. But in time, that will then has to really change. You know, when I look at my own journey, I incorporated lots of external capital. So I joined a boxing gym, and which was amazing for me and my social recovery. But it was totally separate from that world. I had to start to remove myself. So I had to have a foot in one camp and foot in another camp. And what I found was that community, the boxing community, was still very, very supportive of who I am and what I do. But it gave me a chance to forget about it and start to morph into the so-called normal world. And what was really interesting was, when you were talking, I was kind of looking at one of the reasons why I found it particularly difficult to get into recovery. And believe it or not, we talked about stigma. I had my own stigma. And one of the reasons why I didn't want to get well was because I didn't want to be part of that community. I didn't want to have to accept that I was one of them, you know. And how can someone in that be stigmatized? But I was. And one of the main things about that connection was once I realized that actually I am one of those people. And again, it all falls down to your own personal beliefs, your morals and your values and who you are at your core as to who life has shaped you to be, which slightly conflict with those. And again, that's one of the reasons why it's a model. It's particularly difficult to implement because it's so person specific. But within a community, if you've got so many people within that community, there is somewhere that can plug that gap, you know. And I loved the tandem element to Chime, which I think is massive, you know. And you're right, there's a shift between the person who's driving the bike, and you know, the two people should constantly shift. You know, the person who's in recovery can say, well, where do you want to go? And you know, you can ride there together, and that you can support each other. But you can also come to a fork in the road where, you know, neither of you really has much of an idea which way you want to go, but the person who's in recovery can say, well, actually, I do know that this does work. It might not be for you, but let's go there anyway. And I think, you know, if you've got a recovery community which are all supporting each other, there's various different people can jump on the driving seat of that bike, and there's various different people can be on the passenger seat just pedaling along as part of the journey, supporting.
And I do like that idea with the tandem thing, that, you know, potentially they swap who's steering at different points, you know, there'll be points they go off and each cycle their own cycle, and then they come back together in the tandem. Yeah.
And it's about that empowerment thing, isn't it? It's about saying, you know, we'll go off there, you know, you choose your path, you choose your recovery pathway, but I will be there to support you. And I think that's what I found was really difficult in the early days for me, because I would go to therapy, I would go to counselling and what have you, and I suppose they would give me a bike, but it's my own bike, which I have to pedal myself. And initially I'd feel great, you know, I'd just, again, using that metaphor, I'd cycle away from my session feeling enlightened. But I've got no direction. Where am I going on? Where am I taking this bike? Ultimately, where I'm going is back to the place where I'm extremely unhappy because I have nothing else. And ultimately, that's a really bad place for me to take that bike, because the only time I'll see you again is in 2 weeks' time. So what's in between?
It's really interesting. The last point for me, David, is like, it seems to me the M in Chime changes. So there's something about at the start, the M in Chime is about go off your arse and do something. It doesn't matter what you do. Routine, activity, effort, energy, do stuff with other people. But that M has to translate to something that's much more like existential meaning further down the line, so that, you know, not just in the what am I going to do today, that there is actually that sense of purpose. And I think that's where the M takes on that. If it's not spiritual, it doesn't have to be spiritual. It can be spiritual, but it can certainly take on those vision, goals, aspirations, positive kind of long-term objectives. And it seems to me lots of the letters change from short-term, you know, into that much bigger who am I type person question.
Guys, I know you're really pressed for time. So if you need to jump off, I just want to really thank you. I'm good to stick around and run over a bit. So
yeah, I'm afraid I've got another meeting at 12 and I need to do a bit of preparation. So I'm going to jump off if that's all right. And I shall see all three of you, if not before, I shall see you next week.
Great stuff. David, thank you so much for your time. Very beneficial for everyone.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Lauren, Adam, have you still got a bit more time?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, are you having fun?
I am. I'm really enjoying. I could talk about this stuff all day, David. I really could.
Okay. Lauren, are you having fun?
Yeah, and I love your insight, Adam. The description you just said about driving off, like cycling off on your own. I think that the visual image of that and why communities and recovery communities are so important. Oh, it's just perfect. Yeah, I've not thought about it like that before, but it's just such a good analogy.
Yeah, and it really is, because the life of someone in addiction is extremely lonely, and the battle with themselves is hard enough. You know, the battle with the guilt and the shame, and you know when you're looking at before a time when they've been able to put aside and deal with all of that historical stuff, it's still very much in the psyche, and you're stuck in that world. And to go to a therapy session is great, but then to go initially straight back to that old life which you're trying to escape from and be stuck there on your own for such a long period of time, it's really, really difficult to get out of. So it's about having something to go to straight away and something to be involved in until the next session and the next session. But identity is massive, because we're all different in regards to who we think we are as opposed to who we want to be. If you look at the ego model, and I suppose a lot of people don't really know who they are or even who they want to be. I think they know they don't want to be who they currently are, but how do they get to where they think they might want to be? That's really difficult. And that when you were talking about the guy who owned the nightclubs and was the dealer and all that, you could see that there's obviously a real process that's had to change there, because that identity of being that big personality within the community for all the wrong reasons stayed with that person and stayed with them throughout and caused its own problems. Yeah. So that person would have to evaluate, is that the identity that I want? And is that me? And change that. And that process is so, it's an ongoing process forever and ever. Who I thought I was, as opposed to who I am, changes constantly. Who I want to be, how I want to present, who I think I'm going to be in the future, it changes all the time. So this shows like the longevity of the piece of work that needs to be done community-wise to support people.
Lauren, what have you learned from today?
Oh gosh, that recovery is complex and there's no one answer to these things. Everybody's perspective sheds light on different aspects of the journey and what works, what doesn't work. But I think I've also learned about how having an understanding of the things that do help, what's important to recovery and desistance. I mean, even in terms of attitudes, like David was saying, lots of recovery workers don't believe in the true potential of recovery and how successful recovery is. So to keep talking about the things that work and the things that help, I think is important. And to have a varied community, not just academics and not just students, but be able to speak about it in a much more, organic and authentic way with a blend of people. I think I take personally much more out of that than just in a classroom environment. So inspiring.
So what I really appreciated, and if I may expand on it, you said you had a family member that was kind of 18 months. And then something else. I would like to get kind of curious about that from two ways. Yeah. One, the personal impact it's had on you, and my experience is, once someone's had an experience of recovery, you cannot unlearn what you've learned. So they're still in a process of recovery. They're just kind of using.
Yeah, that's really interesting actually, because he is much better than he was. So it's interesting you say that. I mean, he has broken bones from drinking, been hospitalized, he's hurt other people. It's been really bad. So those 18 months were a sort of a rock bottom moment, I suppose. He'd broken ribs from being drunk, and at that point decided something needed to change. So that was a positive time. Relationships improved. Everybody felt closer, calmer, could communicate more clearly, were happier to spend time together, and there were no sort of side effects. So when it dropped off, I suppose because I've seen moments of recovery throughout my life, I suppose it was a feeling of being tired with it, to be completely honest. Just not fed up, but yeah, Yeah,
It's like, oh
and
fuck, I've
sad.
heard this before. I know this
Yeah,
movie. I don't want to. Okay,
you were
great.
doing so well. You know, everything was better. Why, why that sort of exasperation? And I suppose for me, what was actually quite cathartic about the research that I was doing was attending those recovery groups and hearing people in recovery talk about and have awareness of their actions and the ripple effects. So to be a sort of just an outsider listening in, that was a process that helped me to maintain, I suppose, empathy and boundaries, because it's a process for me of, I understand and I want to be there and I support and I love, you know, those things don't change. But to keep my energy safe, I have to keep barriers in around how I communicate and on what terms I see them, because there's only so much I can do.
Yeah. And in that process, what have you recovered back for yourself?
I suppose it's calm and acceptance, because if thinking about the model, my relational component, that relational factor doesn't have to change. I can love them as a person and spend time with them on my terms, so that I'm not stressed or, you know, brought down by the circumstances. So keeping control, I suppose, and yeah, keeping myself safe within that, while still loving, supporting, connecting. It's a balance, I guess.
Yeah.
You see, my struggle, I guess, particularly with the UK market, for want of a better word, which I'm trying to come to terms, is there's this notion of like, this is lived experience. You've had to have done it to be lived experience, where the reality is everyone's got fucking lived experience around it, you know? So you don't necessarily have to have been the user to be impacted by the lived experience. And I think the narrative out there needs to be changed as well. Like everyone deserves recovery, just which parts do you need to recover and where do you need to go for that?
I'm feeling safe as well to speak about it, because for me, the stigma and the implications of speaking about it for them and their work, I'm always conscious of that. So I try to maintain an element of anonymity about who they are in relation to me.
Right. Yeah.
So not always having to be, I suppose, outed or to use that lived experience to be valued as contributing and knowledgeable in whatever background that might be. But yeah, like I think speaking about it is also important, because you create a different level of connection and learning and knowledge, but that it's not always necessary to have a fruitful knowledge exchange, I suppose.
Yeah.
So for me, personally, sorry, Adam, just 1 second. Personally, yeah, you as an academic, a doctor, and me down here, I just think, oh fuck, what do you think? What do you know? You don't know. Now that you've shared your lived experience, it's like, oh, okay, she gets it. Yeah. And I personally feel a lot safer and more trusting and more excited. So I just wanted to, over to you, Adam. Sorry about that, mate.
No, it's just to add on to that. I mean, what could be a better example of lived experience and living through that traumatic experience as someone who observes someone they love with every being of their, core of their being, go through that stuff and feel helpless, but be massively impacted as well, and experience your own trauma, and then have to make decisions along the lines of, I can't be part of this anymore, and I need to let that person go who I love, because I have to put boundaries in, otherwise this is going to continually impact me in a really bad way. So that, yeah, you're absolutely right, and I think that's something that we don't look at as much as lived experience is lived experience. You don't have to be the substance user to have the lion's share of that hold on that title, if you like. It's as part of that community, it is about bringing everyone in, because we've all got shared experience of being alive, being part of this thing that we're all in. So lived experience, you're right, it's massive, it's everybody.
So let's just take this a little bit deeper. So Recovery Connections is a peer-led lived experience organization.
It is.
And it is traumatic for people when they come in from, I'm going to say, the normal world, like corporate world, and they come into Recovery Connections and everyone's talking about their feelings and they're checking in and they're building containers and they're bringing their authentic self. It's traumatic for people.
Yeah.
I mean, people come and think, what the fuck is going on here?
Yeah.
It's confronting. It confronts people because they're used to, there's a normal format and routine for these things. I like that it creates upheaval. And I think, they're some of the most impactful talks for my students, for example. It's when people speak to them about what they've been through, and that their faces, they're all listening, they're all connected because it means more. It doesn't mean that people should always feel that, because some people aren't ready to share, and I saw that a lot in recovery groups. They're not ready to share their journey, but they're ready to be part of it and to hear other people's. So I suppose the thing that I'm trying to get at is that people shouldn't be forced to share it if they don't feel safe enough and ready to.
No, Dev, I completely agree. I completely agree.
So to give you an example of how we're trying to combat that, really, I suppose it's a really hostile, scary environment for someone who's a family member or a friend to come into. So that's why we are kind of taking it out into the community. So on Saturday, I told you I had the coffee bike out, and we went to a local football club. So it's Northern League, it's right down there in the league, but there was still 2,000 people there. And we had the coffee bike and we were giving out 3 cups of coffee in exchange for just a conversation. Nothing deep, nothing, too strenuous. We just explained who we are and why we're there, and we're just dishing out a free cuppa just to let you know that, this is what recovery looks like. The 3 people here used to be in that mess and they're not anymore. And we're just chatting to people just to show that it's possible, but just to reduce the stigmatized element, and I suppose do it in a more organic, less intense way. And the conversations that we started having with people were amazing. A lot of people will say, I don't live in that world myself. However, my partner, my brother, my sister, my cousin, my auntie's gardener, whatever, it affects so many people. So that's just a way of not crowbarring it in the way we do in the community building itself. It's just a really softly approach to let community people know and family and friends know that we're expanding this out, so we're supporting everybody, not just those people who are affected by the substance itself.
And David spoke about bridging the gap, didn't he? And how I think we all have a role in bridging the gaps, and that sounds like exactly what you're doing.
Yeah.
So Lauren, which university are you from?
Lincoln.
Okay. So as an institution, what's the Lincoln University doing to support students in that? Oh, did I just ask a question? I just saw your eyes go, oh, fuck.
So it was something I explored and have explored a couple of times since joining, about recovery orientated support or sober activities. Sometimes with institutions, let me broaden this out, there is sometimes a reluctance to promote recovery orientated activity explicitly, as if it in some way acknowledges a problem that university has with addiction or drugs or alcohol. So I think there are still challenges around breaking down stigma.
You're being so politically correct.
To more explicitly support recovery, and it's something I'm pushing for and will continue to keep working towards. I think it's Newcastle that Adam worked with in creating a recovery community of support. I think you've mentioned something like that before, Adam, and that sounds fantastic. And I think I remembered saying that's what we need at every university. There should be no reason that there isn't that support available.
So at the moment, we work with Teesside and Sunderland and Birmingham and Chester University. So we're really trying to push the agenda to get the institutions to recognise that there's a need to recognise this and support it. And one of the things you'll find with the universities, and they love any form of inclusion. They'll talk about any other diverse group, but what they won't do is talk about the recovery community. And you've got to blame if there is.
And why is that? Why is that?
It's a cultural thing, but I suppose it kind of boils down to money. University
and advertising. So it's if you're openly supporting recovery, maybe parents on open days might think, oh, so there's a problem with addiction here. They need recovery support. There's lots of drugs. I think there's that association that by explicitly supporting recovery, there's a problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me just take it to, so when I've done a lot of corporate work at wellness days, and we've gone to talk about addiction or substance use disorder or anything like that, it's a very quiet table.
Yeah.
Because people think, oh, I don't want to go to that table. People either think I've got a drug problem, yeah, and I'm going to be outed, yeah, and so those are the sort of challenges that we've got to. It's our role to try and normalize it. So Middlesbrough as a recovery city. So how do you change the language in all the statutory institutions? How do you change it within the schools? How do you change it within the police, within the national health, within job market, within churches, within how do we normalize this thing? Of course, you're going to go to university and get fucked. That's part of the culture. That's how you break your inhibitions. That's how you find partners. That's how you bond. That's how that is part of it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why there's so much drinking in the workplace, because people drink and it's good for business.
Yeah.
It's when it's not good for business anymore, and it's not good, and then it's the fuck, I'm in trouble. Where do I go for help?
Yeah, and it's.
Sorry, I can feel my excitement getting.
No, it's a cultural thing. It's something that's ingrained within us. I think back in the day when people didn't have to pay for the tuition fees, it probably wouldn't have been so much a problem. Now, universities are a business and they need to attract people. And what Lauren was saying is predominantly one of the main reasons. How can you attract people to a place if you think that it's got a problem with substance misuse? And
the message should be, you should come to us because we got a solution for problem misuse.
Exactly. That's how it should be seen. But again, with stigma, it's just not that way. To give you an example, on a much smaller scale, right? Just around the corner from me, there's a community cafe on the estate where I live, and they it's not a homeless cafe. It's nothing of the sorts. And there's no set prices for the food. What you would do is you would just go in and you pay what you can afford. They give you an envelope. If you can afford 50p, you get a full English breakfast for 50 pence. If you can pay more, you pay more. And it's just to get the community together and to build those links. And it's a really, really, really amazing place. And I was in the shop next door waiting to be served. And I heard two people talking about the cafe, and they were like, proper Les Dawson stuff over the two women over the garden fence, sneering and like, oh, I heard they cook for homeless people. Well, I wouldn't eat in there, And I felt like I didn't butt in because it's not my place to. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion, and I can understand why they would, they would think that way. But it's not a homeless cafe, and I felt like saying, what do you think's going on in there? Do you think they're drying the pots with a homeless person's underpants or something? I don't, what. It's a beautiful, clean cafe. They're just providing cheap food and trying to bring the community together. But their stigmatized view was that it's a homeless cafe and I wouldn't set foot in there if you paid me. And I think that's just a cultural thing that, we just try and break down those barriers bit by bit by bit. And if you look at where Recovery Connections was 6 years ago to where it is now, You know, we're doing that, but it's a lifetime's piece of work. It won't be done by the time I'm 6 feet under, you know. We just got to keep chipping away.
And that will increase access to recovery, because I think some people still don't access recovery support because of an idea about who that's for.
Yeah.
But it's for everybody, you know, and it's those sort of ideas that might stop people setting foot in the cafe or going to the recovery group that they need.
Yeah. And I think if you can put it to different terms to people, so you can say, okay, you don't use substances, but we all live in this really stressful world. You know, we have this lifestyle enforced upon us where we have to pay the mortgage, we have to have a job, you know, we're turned into a worker from the moment of being 5 all the way through school. You know, we're conditioned to be part of a system where we pay into the system where we don't have any control over it. You know, it can be a horrible, stressful place to be in. And yes, you don't use substances, but you need support as well. So, you know, what do you do as a coping mechanism? You might not think that you've got a problem with life. Do you online shop like it's going out of fashion? Do you gamble? You know, are you addicted to online dating? Are you addicted to dating? Caffeine, relationships, you know, these little codependent things that you are doing, which you don't realize are addictive traits. You know, it's about educating people that we all need these elements incorporated into our life. It would help. We don't need them, but it would really, really help if you understood the bigger picture.
Okay, I'm going to have to start to wrap up. I'm more than happy to leave you, hand over host to the two of you, and you can carry on chatting if you want. But
I've also got to head, I'm afraid. My dog's been waiting for a walk for the past hour.
Yeah. All right. I cannot thank you both enough. Adam, this will go down towards your certification as well as part of your practicum and hours. So thank you very much for your time as well, being here today. And yeah, so let's start a checkout. So Lauren, a checkout is where you check out how you're feeling and something that you've learned in a takeaway. And yeah, so who would like to go first? I know Adam's very familiar with the wording container, checking in and out and all that stuff. Adam, do you want to start? Let's start with you, actually.
Yeah. Okay, David, I'm going to check out with joy. And the reason why I'm checking out with joy is, if you'd asked me to check in at the beginning, I'd have said I'm probably checking in with a slight bit of trepidation and resentment that you've taken away 2 hours of my bank holiday Monday. How dare you? But you know what? As with always, once I've done this stuff and once I've talked about the subject that I love and once I've got to connect with other people, and it's really topped me up with goodness and wellness, and I do feel very, very joyful. Thank you.
Great. So I'll go next. First, I check out with joy. And yeah, I had no idea this was a bank holiday when I sent out the invite, Adam, and the intention was to kind of bring your wisdom here too. So and I'm deeply grateful to David, Lauren, and yourself for using this time on a bank holiday. And I've learned a lot, and it's really great having the academic credibility come in and share their voice, which is very much aligned to what we're talking about from the lived experience perspective. So I'm very humbled and grateful. Lauren, it has been lovely to meet you. How are you checking out?
I'd probably say reinvigorated. The monotony of my work life sometimes disconnects me from my passion for recovery and desistance stuff. So to be able to reconnect with it and to take away the importance of it and the learning and the openness, I think it re-sparks my passion for why I'm in this field and why I love doing what I do. So yeah, thank you.
All right. So while we've got your passion and your kokorozashi, would you like to come back on with another lecture sometime?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, Great. So let us know when and what it would be about, and how it fits in. We'd love to have you.
Fabulous. Thank you. Yeah, no, I'd love to.
All right. I'll see you all next Tuesday.
Yeah, see you
Very
then.
well.
Cool. Okay.
Take care.
Bye-bye, everyone. Have a wonderful bank holiday.
Take
Thanks.
care, everyone.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, Adam.